This vlog time to talk about Aprilia Tuono V4. Should you buy one too? Maybe. Hi, I'm Chad and welcome to Virtual Reality. I like to start my vlogs in virtual reality because this is a place where we can go fast. So without further ado, let us go fast. Back to reality. So it's February, which means I've had my Aprilia Tuono V4 for 8 months and I've put over 4,800 miles on it. I've also done 2 track days on this machine as well as a few days out in the canyons. So I think that I'm uniquely qualified to give a pretty high level but fairly comprehensive review of the motorcycle. So first I'm going to talk about how it is as a street bike, then I'm going to talk about how it is as a track bike, and then I'll give you my final thoughts and ultimately let you know whether or not you should be thinking about buying a motorcycle like this one. But before we get started, I'm just going to give you guys a quick overview of this bike. You probably know what this is if you're watching this video, but in the off chance that you don't, the Aprilia Tuono V4 is the naked version of the RSV4 Superbike that Aprilia has continued to make since, I believe, 2009. Now, obviously, the Tuono V4 ditches the full fairings and the clip-ons and gets a flat handlebar. And there's a few other differences, but this bike has a lot more in common with the RSV4 than it has different. For example, this uses the same chassis, so the same frame and swing arm as the RSV4. It also uses the same Aprilia Performance Ride Control Suite, or APRC, of electronics to make the motorcycle easier and safer to ride. Uses the same Brembo M50 monoblock brake calipers. Has the same cast wheels that the RSV4 RR has. And uses the same suspension as the RSV4 RR, although I suspect with slightly softer springs. So in short, Aprilia took the RSV4 and said, hey, how can we make this a little bit more comfortable to ride on a regular basis, but not compromise the performance much, if at all? And voila, you have the Tuono V4. So one of the key differences, besides obviously the riding position, the plastics, and a couple other bits and bobs, is the engine in this motorcycle. So this is still a 65-degree V4, slightly larger capacity than the RSV4 of the time, which was only 1,000 cc's. This is 1,077, but they call it an 1,100. Now with those extra cc's, you get a slightly lower rev limit and a motor that isn't as geared towards top-end performance, but still makes a crap ton of horsepower. More than anybody riding on the street needs. But that isn't to say that having a crap ton of horsepower on the street isn't fun, because it certainly is. But this bike actually makes, if I recall correctly, more power from idle up to 8,000 RPM than an RSV4 does, and does same engine speeds. Which, you know, again, reinforces and supports the fact that this is a motorcycle that is designed to be ridden more on the street, but will still hold its own on the track. So yeah, in summary, basically the Tuono V4 is an RSV4 with a handlebar and less plastics. Now let's talk about it as a street bike and what I think of it in that regard. Starting off with the ergonomics, this bike is fairly comfortable but aggressive still. I suspect that the foot positioning and overall positioning of your lower body really isn't any different from an RSV4. The pegs are pretty high and kind of far back, so if you're going on a very long trip on the freeway, my legs might cramp up a little bit, but I have had this bike on multiple day trips, you know, riding up to and over 200 miles in a single day, highway, twisties, kind of all over the place, and I didn't find it to be an issue personally. That said, I am also very accustomed to super sport bikes and sporty motorcycles that have a foot positioning like this, so there wasn't much getting used to for me in that regard. As far as your upper body goes, you are still pitched a little bit forward. It's nothing crazy, obviously not like riding a super sport bike or a super bike with clip-on bars, but at the same time, certainly not like riding a Yamaha FC or MT10, depending on where you live, where the bar is a bit higher and you sit a little bit more upright. This bike still lets you know that it is a sporty machine. One of the things that surprised me most about this bike is how comfortable the seat is. You know, it's very soft and pretty plush, but still grippy at the same time. So it's awesome for sitting on the freeway with your cruise control set, or moving around from side to side in the canyons or at the track. It's probably the best compromise you could ever have in regard to the seat of a sporty motorcycle. I very much approve of this. The last thing that I think I have to say about the riding position is the fact that you sit pretty on top of this bike. It's not like a lot of other naked bikes where you sit a little bit more in the bike. You know, the bars come up a little higher to meet you. I think this is kind of the Italian way in design, where they have a high seat and a nice sexy low tank. It feels good. You feel very in control of the motorcycle all of the time, but again, it is a bit sportier than some of your other naked bikes out there. So now getting into the suspension a bit from a street perspective, as I mentioned before, this has the same suspension as the RS V4 RR of this model year, 2017. It's the SOX fully adjustable suspension, which is nice that, you know, a naked super bike like this that is a little bit more geared towards street riding still has fully adjustable suspension. Yeehaw! Now this bike has been set up for a rider of my size and weight. I am 6'3" and about 220 pounds, and it feels good. Again, it's still sporty. You can probably see I'm shaking just a little bit going over bumps here, but it does a good job of cushioning those bumps, especially the harder ones. But if you do hit a pretty nasty pothole or something like that, it will still jolt you pretty hard. That said, small imperfections in the road, it does a good job of smoothing those out. But at the same time, if you want to take a corner with some pace, suspension's got the ability to provide the traction that you're going to need to make it around that corner and keep it upright, while also staying confident in it. In terms of other street situations, such as making a U-turn or you're just turning corners, emergency braking, the bike handles very well. It's incredibly nimble, and the amount of leverage that you get with these nice flat bars is excellent. So despite you sitting very on top of the bike, it's still a very easy motorcycle to control. Now, in regard to the brakes, as I mentioned before, the Tuono V4 1100 RR 2017 and up, as well as the Tuono V4 factory, use the Brembo M50 monoblock calipers. These are a very premium caliper that Brembo provides to, you know, manufacturers of super bikes and such. They're the same calipers that are actually on the Ducati Panigale V4, so you know they're tried and true and great. It's also got a Brembo master cylinder and Brembo rotors. The brakes on this motorcycle are phenomenal, the best that I have ever used. The initial bite is fantastic. The lever pull is very precise. You don't have to pull the lever in a lot to get a lot of braking force, which was something to get used to coming from my Daytona 675R that has an older generation of Brembo brakes, where the bite isn't quite as hard initially and the lever pull and stopping power is a bit more progressive. But once I got used to these brakes, they're amazing. And now circling back to the 1070cc 65-degree V4 that is found inside this beautiful motorcycle. It is an amazing engine. It is mind-boggling the kind of power this thing makes. Now obviously that's all contextual. This is the first liter bike that I have ever owned, so the adjustment has been quite something. Thank you, sir. I mean, if you look at that, that was a roll-on, maybe 50% throttle from 4,500 RPM. That just pulls like a freight train. This bike has a very great balance of low end, mid-range, and top end power. It's a super strong engine, and that mid-range power is particularly nice when you're riding on the street. You might find yourself in an emergency situation that you need to find your way out of. You know, this bike has the power that you're going to need to do that. Nonetheless, it is a lot of power, and that was one of the things that was most challenging for me to come to terms with initially. Put some extra emphasis on this. This bike has a lot of power everywhere. If you're coming up to a Tuono V4 from a middleweight super sport bike, or you know, something in a 600 or 750 class, this thing's gonna knock your socks off. It is crazy fast in comparison. That's gonna bring me into the electronics, because those are going to help you not to crash when you're getting on the gas a little bit too hard. So this bike has a full suite of electronics known as Aprilia Performance Ride Control, or APRC, and as that name insinuates, these electronics are meant to give you the ability to ride in a sporting, quick manner, but give you a bit of a safety net so that if you do make a mistake, you're less likely to fall down. So this bike has an inertial measurement unit that detects roll, pitch, and yaw, and enables the bike to make decisions with the cornering ABS system, as well as some of the other electronic features. So this bike has 8 levels of traction control, 3 levels of wheeling control, 3 levels of cornering ABS, 3 levels of launch control, 3 different engine maps, cruise control, and a pit lane limiter. So some of those sound very track oriented, especially that pit lane limiter, and I'll get to those from a track perspective in just a moment here. But in terms of street, first, wheelie control. It's a great feature to have on a bike that's this powerful. There have been a couple times where I've been pulling out into traffic and had to accelerate in a hurry and was a little greedy with the throttle and got the front wheel off the ground. But rather than me having to panic and chop the throttle or, you know, ride it out like a superhero, which I'm not very good at, the bike simply said, I don't think you want to do this. I'm going to bring the front wheel down. This also helps when you're trying to accelerate quickly for other intents and purposes. Again, we'll get into the track stuff later, but the wheelie control on this bike is fantastic. It does a good job of giving you a little bit of play. The front wheel will come off the ground just a little bit when you have it down on the lowest setting, which is 1, and ultimately offer you a good time. Also, worth mentioning, the way that these electronics work, they're all numbered. They all have APRC numbers from 1 to 3 for cornering ABS, wheelie control, and launch control, and 1 to 8 for traction control. So with each of those electronic aids, the higher the number signifies the higher the amount of intervention that the bike will have. For example, if you have traction control on 8, you're going to get traction control intervening going over painted lines on crosswalks when you're accelerating gradually. But if you have it on a low setting, such as 3 like I have, you really don't feel it at all. Same goes for wheelie control, ABS, and launch control. So if you're going to have electronic assistance with wheelies and traction and acceleration, obviously you're going to want help slowing down and not locking up the front wheel, and this bike has the cornering ABS to do it. That's where that IMU comes into play. It's a Bosch 9.1 MP, and that's going to make it so that the bike can modulate the brake more precisely with it leaned over in a corner. As you might be aware, the more you lean a motorcycle, the smaller your contact patch of your tire to the road gets, and therefore the less grip you have. So it's pretty awesome for your brakes to be able to modulate themselves accordingly and take that lean angle into consideration so as to prevent you from locking up the front wheel if you're trail braking deep into a corner. That said, you can still see how this is useful for riding on the street. You know, whether you're just going down the street and trying to turn a corner and have to come to a quick stop because of traffic, or if you're out riding in the canyons with your friends and, you know, there's a cliff on the right side of you and you come into a turn a little bit too hot and really need to use those brakes to make sure that you can slow down enough to make the corner. It's going to help you out. It's what it's designed to do. So the last street feature that I want to talk about, which is one of my favorites I'm using right now, it's cruise control. Brilliant. I don't know how it took so long for cruise control to make its way onto motorcycles. It seems like something that wouldn't be very difficult to rig up on a bike. I understand why it wouldn't be on a super sport bike, and I know that it has been available on some adventure and touring bikes for longer, but on a naked bike like this, I mean, whew, top notch. It's pretty awesome. And of course, obviously, I know some of the more recent super bikes have this feature as well, but man, is it a game changer. I love just being able to cruise and not have to worry about my speed, chilling out on the highway. It's really awesome and saves you some fatigue for sure. Now it's pretty simple. There's a switch on the left handlebar controls. You press it in, hold it down. That activates the cruise control feature. Then you simply press it in again when you've reached the speed that you desire to cruise at, and it sets your cruise control. There's a few different ways to cancel. You can grab the brake, you can click the throttle forward like I just did, or you can press the button in again. Very intuitive, simple, and straightforward. So I guess one other thing that I should probably mention, being that my gas light has been on for the last 8.5 miles, is this bike's fuel range. There's a lot of people that say this bike doesn't get great fuel economy, and in a lot of cases they'd be right. The reason primarily is because it's such a fun bike to give gas. That V4 engine just sounds amazing. So how can you blame anyone for just wanting to twist the throttle all the time? But naturally, when you twist the throttle, you consume fuel. So there's that. But that said, I usually get pretty decent range, at least 100 miles out of a tank in most cases, riding on the street. The highway will stretch that out to 120, 130. It would be nice if it had a fuel gauge, but I haven't had a fuel gauge on a motorcycle in like 5 years, so I can live with it. I just reset my trip computer every time I get gas, so I know what my range is like, how much range I have consumed. So now, let's talk about it as a track toy. As I mentioned before, I have completed 2 track days on this bike, both at Chuckwalla Valley Raceway, once clockwise and once counterclockwise. I hadn't initially planned to take this bike to the track when I bought it. I mean, I figured at some point there was a possibility it was going to end up there, but definitely not that soon. I had a delay in getting my Daytona 675R track bike ready. My brakes were being rebuilt and the seals were on back order from Triumph for a few months, so I just ended up riding this and I had a blast. It's a different experience for sure than riding a super sport bike. Obviously your wind protection is significantly less and your riding position is a lot different. That said, I really enjoyed things like the super comfy seat and the sound of the V4 engine when you whack the throttle wide open. I'm just kidding, I never whack the throttle wide open. That would be silly and probably result in a critical mistake. Always open the throttle smoothly. Or try your best to, as I do. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, this bike still has a fairly aggressive, sporty riding position. It definitely doesn't feel like a stranger at the track. Having that natural forward-leaning body position and those high pegs and tucked up lower body are awesome when you're on the racetrack. You have a lot of ground clearance, your legs are set up the right way to be able to grip the tank, and the bars are low enough where you can still tuck down pretty easily against the tank and tuck down when you're in a corner. Again, this all gives you excellent control over the motorcycle when you're trying to ride it fast. It makes you feel very comfortable on it, and it is insanely fast. Again, I mentioned that from a street capacity, but when you're at the racetrack and you can pin it on the straights and really use all of that horsepower, it's mind-boggling. Absolutely changed my perception of speed. I was consuming straightaways at a rate that I could not ever comprehend previously when riding my Daytona 675R at the track. Now, I know that the speedometers on all these bikes are generally a little bit off, but I was hitting an indicated 20 miles an hour higher top speed on this bike at Chuckwalla than I do on my Daytona 675R. So, yeah. I mean, not shocking, obviously, given the abundance of power in comparison, but nonetheless, it's a lot faster. Which means it's helpful to have a lot more brakes. And again, just like it does on the street in terms of braking performance, this bike delivers. The brakes are super confidence-inspiring. Didn't really fade too much throughout both days. And running counterclockwise, literally lap after lap all day long, I'm braking from indicated 140 miles an hour plus for a 60-ish mile an hour corner, going down from 5th gear all the way to 2nd, and just mashing the brakes as late as I possibly could. And they work awesome. They're very predictable, feel really good, and work well with the rest of the bike to keep it stable. Now transitioning over into the stability aspect of things, this bike corners phenomenally. It's a fantastic symphony of engine, brakes, chassis, and suspension. It's incredible, and it's so easy to ride fast, or fast by my standards. I'm certainly no superbike racer or lap record holder, but it was very easy for me to get off of my 675R, hop on this, and actually best my own personal best lap time by 2 seconds the first time I rode this bike on track. Which is pretty funny because when I took it out there, I was driving out with it in the cargo van, and I was just like, yeah, I'm gonna take it easy today. I don't want to throw my beautiful Aprilia street bike down the road. That would be a bad time. And I think the second session I got my knee down. After that, it was just a blast. I'm not sure how much the electronics were helping me out on track. If the cornering ABS was working when I was trail braking into corners. Again, I'm definitely not a pro level racer, but I'll trail the brakes into a corner, pretty close to the apex. Not as hard as a pro racer, but if the cornering ABS was working, I couldn't feel it. I just felt grip and confidence. And same with the traction control on the way out of corners. I was rolling on the throttle nice and smooth with the appropriate body position in line, and the bike was hooking up and just driving out of corners great. And then of course another electronic feature that got to talk about, probably should have mentioned in the street aspect, but particularly in the track, is the quick shifter and auto blipper. Man, game changer. Quick shifter obviously I've been used to with my 675R having one, but the auto blipper, man, it's been hard going back to the track with my Daytona 675R and not having that. The quick shifter and auto blipper, obviously racing developed technology to reduce shift time, make you faster overall. Great technology on the street as well. Makes life really easy to just need to use the clutch to get the bike moving and come to a stop without stalling the engine. They're pretty smooth on the street for the most part. Occasional clunk here and there, but overall, just as good as I'd be able to do on my own, if not a little bit better. You get a nice pop when you're partial throttle low RPM, and it's a violent crack when you're hard on the throttle and high RPM. But yeah, on the track, on the street, they work super smooth. The blipper is sublime on the racetrack. The combination of having the front wheel have all the traction when you're braking hard, clicking down through the blipper, and then this bike also has a slipper clutch, so all of that kind of working together makes for imperceptible downshifts. You just hear that amazing V4 rev and some cracks and pops afterwards, and you giggle, and then remember that you need to keep turning the bike in. It can be distracting just because it's so giggle-inducing and fun. But so one of the other track-oriented features that I really love about the Tuono V4, specifically 2017 and up, are the different engine maps. Now, previous Tuono V4s had multiple engine maps as well. The 17 and up bikes have Sport, Track, and Race. All three of those maps give you access to the full 175 horsepower that your stock Tuono would make. They just changed the way that the power is delivered and a couple other characteristics of the engine, such as throttle response and engine braking. So Sport, as you might expect, is the least race, haha, of all the engine maps. So Sport is basically your typical stock tune on a sport bike. Throttle response is good, could be a little bit better. Power delivery is smooth, but there could be a little bit more punch to it. Engine braking, you roll off the throttle, the bike decelerates kind of hard. What you would expect from a sport bike. It's going kind of hand in hand with that. The Sport map gives you the smoothest or most progressive power delivery, so least likely to scare the crap out of you, but again, still gives you access to maximum power at peak power RPM. Now the track map turns things into a crazy party. Your throttle response is much sharper, and on top of that, the power delivery is much more aggressive. You get a much bigger punch in the mid-range than you do with the Sport map, as well as down low. A track also reduces engine braking at upper mid to high RPM. So when you roll off the throttle, the engine braking isn't as aggressive as it is with the Sport map. You don't decel quite as hard. Again, still get access to all 175 ponies at 11,000 RPM. And then that brings us to the race map, which I run all the time, street or track, or canyon carving. The race map gives you that same crisp throttle response that you get with the track map, and that same aggressive power delivery with that punch in the mid-range, but you get even less engine braking everywhere. High RPM, mid RPM, low RPM. You roll off the throttle, the bike decelerates a little bit, but not much. I have found that I really like this because it makes it a lot easier to control your speed, in my opinion. You know, I prefer to use the brakes, whether I'm at the track or riding on the street. And it's nice to not have that jerky throttle close reaction that you get with most sport bikes, in my experience. The reduced engine braking also sounds really cool when you roll off the gas. But I found the race engine map to also be excellent at power delivery coming out of corners. While it does have that aggressive mid-range kick, it's not like it's unmanageable. Regardless of what map you're using, this is a great ride-by-wire throttle. It's very well connected. Even in that sport map, you have that little additional slack in throttle response, but it still feels pretty good and it's predictable. So that, plus these different maps and the overall just power delivery characteristics of the engine in sync with all the electronics, make a bike that is absolutely phenomenal to ride on the track. Again, I set my personal best lap time ever at the track at Chuckwalla on this bike, not even really trying. And when I went back in review and tried to see where I was getting assistance from the ABS or traction control, so my understanding is there are warning lights that'll flash on the dash when the electronics are intervening. But I went back and watched an entire session with my GoPro stuck on my tank looking at the dash, and not once under braking, acceleration did I see those lights come on, except maybe once or twice for wheelie control. But that's it. The electronics are awesome. They're great to have. It's a nice safety net. But honestly, if you're a somewhat experienced rider, especially if you have a decent amount of track time under your belt, you could probably hop on this thing, turn the electronics off, and be all right with it. The chassis is so well equipped to deal with the horsepower that this thing makes. You just have great grip and feel confident everywhere. It's an awesome bike to ride on the track. This is going to seem just a little bit out of place, but given the time of night, but I just remembered and figured that this is important to mention, at least to me. One last thing that I want to mention in regard to riding this bike on the track is the shape of the tank. My Daytona 675R, and if you've ever ridden one, you know they have a kind of a tall gas tank. A lot of surface area on the sides for you to hook your legs onto when you're hanging off the side of the seat in a corner. And you know, being that this is a sexy Italian supermodel of a motorcycle, you know, it's got a very low tank. It's very pretty, but from a functional standpoint, especially with me being 6'3", more legs than torso, just kind of a big guy overall, felt kind of weird hooking my leg up on the top corner of the tank rather than the lower part of the tank itself. That said, after a few laps around the track, maybe going into session 2, I got comfortable with that. It was okay, but just figured that's worth mentioning and probably something a fellow tall rider such as myself would like to know. It's a great bike to ride on the track. Again, very easy to get used to and confidence inspiring, and I've really enjoyed it there. So to wrap this one up, should you buy a Tuono V4? And my answer is, it really depends on how much motorcycling experience you have. This is certainly not a motorcycle for beginners, but if you've got years of riding experience on super sport bikes and super bikes under your belt, a few track days, this thing's gonna scare the crap out of you at first. But once you get used to it, I think you're gonna have the best time of your life. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and gently click the like button. No need to smash or destroy it. That's pretty violent, and I don't like to encourage those sorts of behaviors on my YouTube channel. But anyways, yeah, check it out. Anyways, if you want to see more Tuono V4 videos, Daytona 675R track day stuff, consider subscribing, hit the notification bell if you want to get notified anytime I post a new video. I figure they're probably remotely entertaining. Some people like them. Drop a comment below. Let me know what you thought about my review. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them there and interact with you guys. Happy to take recommendations on videos or, you know, any topics related to a Tuono V4 or riding in general that you'd be interested in hearing about. I like making friends talking about motorcycles, as you likely do too. Anyways, I will see you guys in the next one. Later.